The metal door of interview chamber 7 slid open with a soft hiss, breaking the silence that had filled Station Nexus for the past hour. Dr. Una Park stepped inside, her boots clicking against the polished floor as she made her way to the central table. The room felt cold, almost clinical, with its sterile white walls and harsh overhead lighting that cast sharp shadows across every surface. She had been preparing for this interview for months. The Galactic Historical Archive had been trying to get Krixtal to speak on record for over 3 years, but the old war correspondent had always refused. Today was different. Today, he had finally agreed to share his stories. The door opened again, and Krixtal entered. Dr. Park had seen his species before, but she still found herself impressed by his imposing presence. Standing nearly 7 feet tall, his 6 limbs moved with surprising grace despite his obvious age. His purple carapace was marked with deep scars that told stories of battlefields across the galaxy. Some were clean cuts from energy weapons. Others looked like they came from explosive shrapnel. His multifaceted eyes, each the size of a human fist, swept the room before settling on her. Those eyes had seen things that would break most beings. They held a weight that spoke of decades spent documenting the worst of galactic conflicts. Dr. Park, his voice came through the universal translator, though she could hear the clicking and chittering of his natural speech underneath. I appreciate you making time for this. Thank you for agreeing to speak with us, Krixtal. Your experiences are invaluable to our understanding of recent galactic history. She gestured to the chair across from her, specially designed to accommodate his unique physiology. As he settled into the seat, his lower arms adjusted the recording equipment he had brought with him. Old habits, she supposed. Even in retirement, he still carried the tools of his trade. Before we begin, Dr. Park said, activating the archive's recording systems, I want you to know that this interview will be sealed for 50 years, as requested. Only approved researchers will have access. Krixtal nodded, his antennae twitching slightly. Good. Some of these stories, they might cause problems if they became public too soon. The recording equipment hummed to life, filling the room with a barely audible vibration. Red lights blinked on various devices, indicating that everything was being captured in multiple formats for the archive. State your name and credentials for the record, Dr. Park began, following standard archive. Protocol. Krixtal of the Vex Collective, senior war correspondent for the Galactic News Network. I covered active conflicts for 37 standard galactic cycles before my retirement. His translator made his formal tone sound almost robotic, but Dr. Park could hear the pride in his natural speech. She leaned back in her chair, studying his scarred carapace. You covered conflicts involving dozens of species across the galaxy, but today we want to focus specifically on your experiences with human warfare. Something changed in Krixtal's posture. His upper arms folded across his chest while his middle limbs gripped the edge of the table. It was a defensive posture she had seen before in veterans discussing traumatic experiences. Humans, he repeated, the word seeming to carry extra weight through the translator. Yes, I covered human conflicts extensively, more than I originally intended. What drew you to cover human military actions? Krixtal was quiet for a long moment, his compound eyes reflecting the chamber's lighting like dark mirrors. At first, it was simple curiosity. Humans were new to the galactic stage, barely a century since first contact. Most species dismissed them as just another primitive warrior race. I thought it would be easy stories, quick documentation of typical territorial disputes. He paused, one of his lower arms reaching up to touch a particularly large scar that ran across his left shoulder. I was assigned to cover the Outer Rim Rebellion, standard procedure for a junior correspondent. The conflict was supposed to be minor, a few skirmishes between human colonies and raiders. Nothing that would make galactic headlines. Dr. Park made notes on her tablet, occasionally glancing up at him. But it wasn't what you expected. No, Krixtal said firmly. It was nothing like what I expected. I arrived at Firebase Delta thinking I understood war. I had covered the Zenthari expansion wars, the Kelvon territorial disputes, even the bloody hegemony purges. I thought I had seen everything warfare could offer. His antennae began to twitch more rapidly, a sign of agitation in his species. Was wrong. Completely wrong. The room fell silent except for the gentle hum of recording equipment. Dr. Park waited, understanding that some stories needed time to emerge. I arrived at Firebase Delta, expecting to document another routine territorial dispute, Crixtal continued, his voice dropping to almost a whisper. Instead, I witnessed something that changed my understanding of your species forever. Something that would haunt my dreams for years to come. He leaned forward, his massive frame casting a shadow across the table. Firebase Delta was where I learned that humans don't fight wars the way other species do. Captain Ji-Ho Kim and his unit of 43 Marines were facing impossible odds. The enemy forces outnumbered them 15-1. They had superior weapons, better position and unlimited reinforcements. Crixtal's translator struggled with the emotional undertones in his speech, producing small, static bursts between words. Any rational species would have surrendered immediately. The mathematics were simple. 43 against 650. It was suicide to resist. He paused, his multifaceted eyes focusing intently on Dr. Park. But humans, Dr. Park, humans are not rational, and that terrifies every other species in the galaxy. The memory hit Crixtal like a physical blow as he continued his account to Dr. Park. His compound eyes seemed to lose focus, staring past her into a distant battlefield that still burned in his mind. Firebase Delta was nothing more than prefabricated shelters and hastily dug trenches when I arrived, he said, his voice taking on the distant quality of someone reliving a nightmare. The humans had been there for 3 weeks, establishing what they called a forward observation post. It was supposed to monitor enemy movements in the sector. Dr. Park watched as his lower arms unconsciously mimicked the motion of holding recording equipment, muscle memory from decades of war reporting. I remember stepping off the transport shuttle and thinking how small it all looked. 43. Marines protecting a handful of buildings on a rocky plateau. The enemy forces had been massing just beyond the horizon for days, but the humans seemed almost casual about it. Crixtal's translator caught the emotion in his voice as he described Captain Ji-Ho Kim's first briefing. The captain was young for a human military leader, maybe 30 standard years. He had this calm way of speaking that made you believe everything would work out fine. When he told me they expected to hold the position for as long as necessary, I thought he was either lying or delusional. The first attack came at sunset on Crixtal's second day at the firebase. He had been checking his recording equipment when the sky suddenly filled with streaking plasma bolts and the distinctive whine of energy weapons. The enemy hit us with everything they had, Crixtal continued, his antennae twitching at the memory. Orbital bombardment, hover tanks, assault troops dropping from the sky. I had covered major battles before, but nothing prepared me for the sheer intensity of that first assault. He described how Captain Kim had moved through the chaos like it was routine, calling out orders and repositioning his troops with surgical precision. Sergeant Hana Cho was everywhere at once, her voice cutting through the battle noise as she coordinated defensive fire. What struck me was how calm they remained under pressure. While other species might panic or freeze, these humans treated the battle like a deadly puzzle to be solved. They were scared, I could see it in their faces, but they didn't let fear control them. The siege stretched on for days that turned into weeks. Crixtal watched as the humans rationed their supplies with mathematical precision, making every meal count, every ammunition clip last as long as possible. Medical supplies ran low first, forcing the unit's medic, Corporal Sunho Kang, to get creative with treatments. I watched them adapt in ways that defied logic, Crixtal told Dr. Park. When they ran out of proper medical equipment, they improvised. When their communications array was damaged, they jury-rigged repairs using spare parts from their weapons. Every problem became an opportunity to innovate. Lieutenant Do Yun Lee became a perfect example of human determination. On day 12 of the siege, an enemy mortar round exploded near the communications bunker, sending razor-sharp shrapnel through his left leg. Any reasonable being would have evacuated to the medical station and stayed there. Instead, Lee tied a tourniquet around his leg and kept working. For 6 more days, he maintained communications with command, while blood slowly soaked through his bandages. When I asked him why he didn't rest, he just looked at me like I had asked why he didn't stop breathing. Private Sominyun's story was even more remarkable. A blast on day 15 left her completely deaf, the concussion rupturing both eardrums. In most militaries, she would have been declared unfit for duty and evacuated. But the humans adapted again. Within hours, they had developed a system of hand signals that let Yun continue fighting effectively. She became their spotter, using her enhanced visual awareness to track enemy movements. Her disability became an advantage. Krixtal paused in his narrative, reaching for a container of water with one of his lower arms. The memory was clearly taxing, even after all these years. By day 18, I was documenting what I thought would be their final stand. They were down to 30% ammunition, medical supplies were nearly exhausted, and the enemy had brought in heavy artillery. Any sane military commander would have called for evacuation or surrender. The night sky had been a canvas of destruction, painted with plasma fire and explosions that lit up the darkness like deadly fireworks. Enemy forces had completely surrounded the firebase, their superior numbers allowing them to maintain constant pressure from all directions. That's when Captain Kim made the call that changed everything, Krixtal said, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. A priority message came through on the emergency channel. Civilian transports were attempting to evacuate the colony at New Haven, about 50 kilometers away. The enemy had broken off a large force to intercept them. Doctor. Park leaned forward in her chair. How many civilians? 40,000 beings, Krixtal replied. Humans, Altarians, even some of my own people who had settled there. Families, children, elderly beings who couldn't fight. The transports were defenseless, converted cargo haulers with minimal shields. What happened next defied everything Krixtal thought he knew about military strategy. Instead of using the enemy's divided attention to strengthen their own defenses, Captain Kim made a decision that shocked even his own troops. He ordered an immediate counterattack, not to break out and escape, but to draw enemy forces away from the civilian convoy, 31 Marines against over 400 enemy troops, abandoning their fortified position to fight in open ground. Krixtal's translator struggled with the complex emotions in his voice as he described the scene. Marines who had barely slept in weeks, surviving on emergency rations and pure determination, preparing to sacrifice themselves for people they had never met. I asked Captain Kim if he understood what he was ordering. He looked at me with those human eyes and said something I will never forget. Those are innocent people out there. If we don't act, who will? The dawn sky was still dark when Captain Jiho Kim gave the signal. Krixtal watched from his sheltered position as 31 exhausted Marines prepared for what they all knew would be their final battle. The silence before the attack was deafening, broken only by the distant hum of enemy vehicles and the soft clicking of weapons being checked one last time. I had my recording equipment focused on Captain Kim's face, Krixtal told Dr. Park, his voice heavy with memory. I expected to see fear, maybe resignation. Instead, I saw something that still gives me chills. He looked peaceful, almost serene, like he had found his purpose. The attack began with a single word from Kim. Move. What followed was unlike anything Krixtal had witnessed in his decades of war reporting. The Marines didn't charge blindly across the open ground. Instead, they moved like a single organism, each person knowing exactly where they needed to be and when they needed to be there. Sergeant Hana Cho took point with her squad, using a destroyed hover tank as cover while they advanced. Behind them, Lieutenant Doyun Lee coordinated suppressing fire despite his wounded leg. The precision was incredible. Every movement had a purpose. The enemy forces were caught completely off guard. They had been preparing for a defensive siege, not a desperate counterattack at dawn. Their heavy weapons were positioned to bombard the firebase, not to deal with fast-moving infantry in open terrain. The first 5 minutes were chaos, Krixtal continued. Plasma bolts filled the air like deadly rain. I watched Private Minho Shin take a direct hit to his shoulder, the blast spinning him around and throwing him to the ground. Most beings would have stayed down, but Shin rolled behind cover and kept firing with his good arm. Sergeant Cho saw Shin go down and immediately changed course, zigzagging through enemy fire to reach him. Energy bolts seared the air around her as she grabbed the wounded Marine and hauled him toward a fallen tree trunk. Covering fire, she screamed, her voice carrying across the battlefield despite the noise of combat. The response was immediate. Every Marine within range turned their weapons toward the enemy position that was targeting Cho and Shin. The concentrated firepower forced the enemies to take cover, giving Cho the seconds she needed to get Shin to safety. That's when I understood something crucial about human warfare, Crixtal explained to Dr. Park. They don't just fight as individuals, they fight as a family. Every Marine was willing to risk everything to save their brothers and sisters in arms. The battle raged across the rocky terrain as the Marines pushed deeper into enemy territory. Their plan was working perfectly. Enemy commanders were pulling forces back from the civilian convoy intercept to deal with this unexpected threat. But the cost was becoming apparent. Corporal Sunho Kang, the unit's medic, found himself pinned down by a heavy weapons emplacement that was cutting down Marines as they tried to advance. The enemy had positioned their gun behind a barrier of fused rock, making it nearly impossible to destroy with small arms fire. I watched Kang study the situation for maybe 30 seconds, Crixtal said, his translator struggling with the emotion in his voice. Then he did something that defied all logic. He pulled 2 grenades from his belt and started running straight at the enemy position. The enemy gunners saw him coming and concentrated their fire on the charging medic. Energy bolts struck the ground around his feet, sending up sprays of melted rock and debris. One shot grazed his arm, spinning him sideways, but he kept running. The other Marines were screaming at him to get down, to find cover, but Kang had made his choice. He knew that gun emplacement would kill more of his friends if he didn't stop it. The final 20 meters seemed to take forever, and no time at all. Kang dodged and weaved through the deadly fire, his medical training giving him an understanding of his own body's limits, that he pushed far beyond safe parameters. He reached the barrier with both grenades armed. The explosion was tremendous. When the smoke cleared, the gun emplacement was gone, and so was Corporal Kang. But his sacrifice had worked. The path was clear for the other Marines to advance, and they pressed forward with renewed determination. Every step took them further from their defensive positions and deeper into enemy territory, but it also drew more enemy forces away from the civilian convoy. The battle continued for 3 more hours, Crixtal told Dr. Park. I documented every moment, watching these humans fight with a ferocity that bordered on the supernatural. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and fighting in hostile terrain, but they never stopped pushing forward. Private So Min Yoon, still deaf from her earlier injury, became their eyes and ears in a different way. Without the distraction of sound, she could spot enemy movements that others missed. Her hand signals guided Marine fire teams to targets that would have remained hidden. I watched her coordinate the destruction of 2 enemy command vehicles. Using nothing but gestures and pointing, her disability had become a tactical advantage. As the sun climbed higher, the human forces began to thin. Marines fell one by one, but their sacrifice was buying precious time for the civilian transports. Crixtal's equipment captured the moment when the last enemy pursuit vehicles turned back toward Firebase Delta, abandoning their hunt for the evacuees. That's when Captain Kim's plan reached its final phase, Crixtal said quietly. The civilians were safe, but his Marines were scattered across kilometers of hostile territory with no way home. The survivors began a fighting withdrawal, using every bit of cover available as they tried to make it back to defensible positions. But there were too few of them left, and the enemy had finally organized an effective response. When the relief force finally arrived, I counted 7 Marines still breathing. Captain Kim was among them, unconscious and covered in blood, but his lips were still moving. Even unconscious, he was giving orders, trying to coordinate his people's safety. Dr. Park leaned forward in her chair, her expression intense. The civilian convoy? All 40,000 beings evacuated successfully, Crixtal replied. Every single transport made it to the jump point and reached safety. The humans had traded 36 lives for 40,000 they had never met. The recording equipment in Interview Chamber 7 captured every nuance of Crixtal's voice as he finished his account of Firebase Delta. The weight of those memories was clearly visible in his posture, the way his antennae drooped slightly as he relived the experience. The Battle of Firebase Delta became legendary in human military circles, he continued. They study it in their academies, not for its tactical brilliance, but for what it represents about their character as a species. Krixtal paused, reaching for his water container again. But for me, it was just the beginning of my education in human warfare. I thought I understood sacrifice after witnessing Firebase Delta. I was wrong again. His multifaceted eyes focused on Dr. Park with an intensity that made her uncomfortable. That understanding wouldn't come until I witnessed the siege of Blackwater Station. 6 months after Firebase Delta, Krixtal thought he had seen the worst of human warfare. He was wrong. The assignment to cover the Blackwater Station operation came through routine channels, just another military action to document for the Galactic News Network. He had no idea he was about to witness something that would redefine his understanding of human morality in combat. Blackwater Station was a massive structure, Krixtal explained to Dr. Park, his compound eyes reflecting the memory. Think of a small city floating in space, with docking bays that could handle capital ships and living quarters for 50,000 beings. It controlled the only safe hyperspace route through the Maelstrom Nebula, making it one of the most strategically important locations in the sector. The enemy had seized the station 3 weeks earlier in a surprise attack, cutting off vital supply lines to human colonies on the far side of the nebula. Without those supplies, entire worlds would face starvation within months. I arrived aboard. The assault carrier Indomitable, expecting to document a straightforward military operation, Krixtal continued. The human fleet had overwhelming firepower. They could have simply blasted the station to rubble and built a new one, but that's not how humans think. Commander Yeji Seo was unlike any military officer Krixtal had encountered in his years of war reporting. Where other species produced commanders who were either brilliant tacticians or inspiring leaders, SEO seemed to be both. Her briefing room buzzed with controlled energy as her staff prepared for the assault. The tactical display showed the station's defenses in brutal detail, Krixtal told Dr. Park. Energy shields, automated turrets, fighter squadrons, and enough firepower to destroy a small fleet. But what caught my attention was how carefully the humans studied every detail, looking for ways to minimize casualties on both sides. Lieutenant Bora Choi entered the briefing room with reconnaissance data. That changed everything. Her face was grim as she approached the tactical display, highlighting several sections of the station in red. "Ma'am," she reported, her voice steady despite the devastating news she carried. "Long-range scans confirm enemy forces are using prisoners as human shields. They've positioned them in key locations throughout the station." Krixtal watched the command staff exchange glances, and in that moment he expected to see the cold calculation he had witnessed with other species. Most military commanders would factor the prisoners into their casualty projections and proceed with the mission. "Instead, I saw something that shocked me," Krixtal continued. Commander Seo didn't even hesitate. She immediately began redesigning the entire operation around saving those prisoners. The original plan had called for a direct assault using the fleet's superior firepower to breach the station's shields and overwhelm its defenses. It would have been quick, efficient, and devastating. The new plan was infinitely more complex and dangerous. "We go in quiet," Commander Seo announced, her finger tracing new routes on the tactical display. "Rescue teams first, then we take the station. I want those prisoners out before we fire a single shot at the enemy." What followed was a masterpiece of military planning that impressed even Krixtal's war-hardened sensibilities. The humans identified maintenance shafts, service tunnels, and forgotten access points that their enemies had overlooked. They mapped guard rotations, power distribution patterns, and communication networks with obsessive detail. The preparation took 18 hours, Krixtal told Dr. Park. 18 hours while enemy forces consolidated their positions, and civilian populations on nearby worlds grew hungrier. Most species would have attacked immediately to prevent further enemy preparation. But the humans were willing to accept that tactical disadvantage to save lives. The infiltration began at 0300 station time, when most of the skeleton crew would be at their least alert. Krixtal found himself squeezed into a maintenance shaft, barely wide enough for his insectoid frame, following Corporal Rena Jeon's stealth team through the station's mechanical systems. "I had covered special operations before, but nothing like this," he said. "The humans moved through those cramped spaces like they were born for it. No wasted motion, no unnecessary noise. They communicated through touch and hand signals, creating a language of warfare that was both beautiful and terrifying. Sergeant Hyun Park's team created the diversion that drew enemy attention to the station's main docking bay. False sensor. Readings suggested a massive assault force was preparing to breach the shields, causing enemy commanders to reposition their forces to meet a threat that didn't exist. While the enemy focused on the phantom attack, Corporal Jeon's team reached the prison block, Krixtal continued. What they found there changed the mission completely. The human prisoners were in bad condition after weeks of captivity, but they were alive. However, the rescue team also discovered something their intelligence hadn't revealed. The enemy had captured civilians from 3 other species during their raids across the sector. Any reasonable military unit would have focused on rescuing for their own people, Krixtal explained. The mission parameters were clear: extract human prisoners and withdraw. But when Corporal John saw those alien civilians, beings she had never met and owed nothing to, she made a decision that defied all military logic. Without consulting her commanders or waiting for new orders, John split her already small team to rescue everyone in the prison block. Human and alien alike, she was determined that no one would be left behind. I watched her divide 8 Marines into 4 teams of 2, each responsible for a different section of the prison complex. The risk was enormous. If any team was discovered, the entire mission would fail. The extraction was proceeding smoothly when disaster struck. A routine guard patrol discovered evidence of the break-in and raised the alarm. Suddenly, the station's corridors filled with enemy soldiers, hunting for the infiltrators. What happened next showed me the true heart of human warfare, Krixtal said, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. Private Yunbi Nam volunteered to hold the junction that controlled access to the prison block. 1 person against an entire enemy platoon. Nam positioned herself at a critical intersection where 3 corridors met, giving her multiple angles of fire, but also multiple directions from which enemies could attack. She had enough ammunition for maybe 10 minutes of sustained combat, but the evacuation would take at least 20 minutes to complete. I documented every second of her stand, Krixtal told Dr. Park. She fought with a precision that bordered on the artistic. Every shot found its target, every movement was calculated to maximize her effectiveness while minimizing her exposure to enemy fire. The enemy forces threw everything they had at her position. Energy weapons turned the corridor, walls into molten slag, and grenades filled the air with deadly fragments. But Nam held her ground, using the intersection's geometry to her advantage, and making the enemy pay dearly for every meter they tried to advance. She held that position for 23 minutes, Krixtal said quietly. 23 minutes of continuous combat against overwhelming odds. When her ammunition ran low, she switched to hand-to-hand combat. When her weapons failed, she used debris from the damaged corridor as weapons. When the main assault force finally breached the station's defenses and reached the prison block, they found Private Nam's body surrounded by enemy casualties. She had accounted for 37 enemy soldiers in her final stand, buying enough time for every single prisoner to escape. The station fell 6 hours later, Krixtal concluded, but by then, all the prisoners were safe aboard rescue ships. Humans, Altarians, Zenthari, even 3 members of my own species. Private Nam had died for beings she had never met, simply because they needed help. The aftermath of Blackwater Station became another case study in human military academies, but for different reasons than Firebase Delta. This time, they studied it to understand how tactical flexibility and moral conviction could coexist in combat situations. That's when I realized something that terrifies other species about human warfare, Krixtal told Dr. Park. You don't just fight to win. You fight to uphold principles that most beings abandon the moment survival is at stake. The silence in Interview Chamber 7 stretched for long minutes, as Krixtal seemed to wrestle with memories too heavy for words. Dr. Park had seen this before in veterans, the moment when the weight of everything they had witnessed threatened to overwhelm them. She waited patiently, knowing that some stories needed time to emerge from the depths where they had been buried. There was one more battle, Krixtal finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. The liberation of New Terra. I thought I was Done with war reporting after Blackwater Station, but my editors insisted I cover this one. They said it would be the defining human military action of the decade. New Terra had been one of humanity's most successful colony worlds, home to nearly 2 million people who had built thriving cities in the shadow of purple mountains beneath twin suns. The enemy occupation had lasted 2 brutal years, turning paradise into a nightmare of oppression and systematic cruelty. The stories coming out of New Terra were horrific, Crickstal continued, his antennae drooping with the weight of memory. Mass executions, forced labor camps, entire families disappeared for the crime of speaking their native language. The occupying forces had turned human civilization into a factory for producing suffering. When the Liberation Fleet finally assembled, it was the largest human military force ever gathered in one place. 500 ships carrying over 1 million Marines, supported by orbital bombardment platforms that could turn the planet's surface into glass within hours. I expected the humans to show no mercy, Crickstal told Dr. Park. After 2 years of atrocities, after seeing their people tortured and murdered, I thought they would unleash total war. Instead, I witnessed something that challenged everything I thought I knew about vengeance and justice. General Junho Lim was a legend in human military circles, a veteran of 43 major campaigns who had never lost a battle. His scarred face and grey hair spoke of decades spent in the crucible of combat, but his eyes held a wisdom that impressed even Crickstal's war-hardened sensibilities. The general's first briefing was unlike anything I had ever heard, Crickstal continued. He didn't speak of conquest or revenge. Instead, he talked about liberation in its truest sense. His goal wasn't just to drive out the occupying forces, but to restore hope to a broken world. The operation began with surgical strikes against military targets, carefully planned to minimize civilian casualties, even though those same civilians had been collaborating with enemy forces for 2 years. Human commanders could have justified widespread destruction, but they chose precision over vengeance. I watched the first wave of Marines land in the capital city, Crickstal told Dr. Park. They moved through the streets like liberators, not conquerors. When enemy soldiers tried to use civilian buildings as cover, the humans risked their own lives to flush them out, without damaging homes where families were hiding. The fighting was intense but brief. Enemy forces, demoralized by 2 years of occupation duty and facing the legendary human military machine, began surrendering in large numbers. This was where Crickstal expected to see the true nature of human vengeance revealed. The first group of prisoners was brought to a processing station I was documenting, he said. These were the same soldiers who had terrorized human civilians for years. Some of the Marines guarding them had lost family members to these exact enemies. The potential for revenge was overwhelming. Instead, Crickstal witnessed something that shattered his understanding of warfare forever. The human guards treated their prisoners with professional courtesy, following protocols that seemed almost absurdly civilized, given the circumstances. I watched Captain Woo-sung Choi interrogate a captured officer who had personally ordered the destruction of 3 human settlements, Crickstal continued. This officer was directly responsible for the deaths of thousands of civilians, including children. Captain Choi had every reason to hate him. The interrogation was conducted according to strict human military regulations. No torture, no intimidation, just professional questions asked in a calm voice. When the session ended and the prisoner complained of hunger, Captain Choi shared his own combat rations with the man who had ordered atrocities against his people. That's when I knew I was witnessing something unprecedented in galactic history, Crickstal told Dr. Park. The humans weren't fighting from hatred or a desire for revenge. They were fighting to restore justice, and justice included treating even their enemies with dignity. The liberation of New Terra took 3 weeks, but the real revelation came in the aftermath. As human forces secured the planet and began rebuilding civilian infrastructure, they discovered the full extent of enemy atrocities. Mass graves, torture facilities, execution sites where thousands of innocents had died. I documented the human soldiers' reactions as they uncovered these horrors, Crickstal said, his voice heavy with emotion. I saw grown Marines weep at the sight of children's graves. I watched hardened veterans struggle to maintain their composure as they catalogued evidence of systematic murder. But even in the face of such overwhelming evidence of enemy brutality, the humans maintained their standards. Wounded enemy soldiers received the same medical care as human casualties. Captured officers were fed the same rations as human troops. Prison camps were constructed according to galactic conventions on prisoner treatment. I interviewed human medics who were treating the same enemy soldiers who had tortured their friends, Crixtal continued. When I asked them how they could provide care to such people, they looked at me like I had asked why they continued breathing. Because they're wounded, one medic told me. That's reason enough. The trials of war criminals were conducted with scrupulous attention to legal procedure. Evidence was carefully presented, defendants were given competent legal representation, and sentences were handed down according to established law rather than emotional revenge. That's when I finally understood the true nature of human warfare, Crixtal told Dr. Park, his compound eyes focusing intently on her face. You don't fight from hatred or bloodlust. You fight from love. Love of your families, your principles, your vision of what the universe should be. Dr. Park leaned forward, sensing they were approaching the heart of Crixtal's revelation. How did this change your understanding of humanity's role in galactic affairs? It terrified every other species, Crixtal replied immediately. We had expected humans to be like us, to fight wars for territory or resources or pride. Instead, we discovered a species that wages war as an extension of their moral philosophy. The implications rippled through galactic society like shockwaves. Military academies across dozens of worlds began studying human tactics, not to copy their strategies, but to understand the psychology that drove them. The Vex Collective completely restructured our military education system, Crixtal explained. We stopped teaching our young that strength comes from the ability to destroy enemies. Instead, we began teaching that true strength comes from the restraint to protect those who cannot protect themselves. Other species followed suit. The Altarian Empire introduced ethics courses into their officer training programs. The Zenthari Federation began requiring their soldiers to study human codes of conduct. Even the warlike hegemony started questioning whether their traditional approach to warfare was truly effective. But the most profound change was in how we viewed conflict itself, Crixtal continued. Before studying human warfare, most species saw war as a tool for imposing will on others. Humans showed us that war could be a tool for preserving values and protecting the innocent. The recording equipment in Interview Chamber 7 captured every nuance as Crixtal reached his final conclusions. Decades of war reporting had led him to this moment of understanding, and his words carried the weight of profound revelation. Your people terrify us, he said, his multifaceted eyes reflecting the chamber's lights like dark mirrors. Not because you're natural killers or because you enjoy violence. You terrify us because you've turned warfare into an expression of love. Dr. Park felt the emotional weight of his words as Crixtal continued. When humans go to war, you carry your families with you, your principles, your hopes for the future. You fight not to destroy your enemies, but to preserve everything you hold dear. That kind of moral clarity in the midst of chaos is something most species cannot comprehend. As the interview concluded and the recording equipment powered down, Crixtal rose from his chair with the careful movements of someone carrying invisible burdens. At the chamber door, he paused and turned back to face Dr. Park one final time. I have covered wars across the galaxy for over 4 decades, he said quietly. I have seen species fight for territory, for resources, for pride, for survival. But I have only seen one species fight for love. That species is humanity. The door sealed shut behind him with a soft hiss, leaving Dr. Park alone with the weight of his words and the profound understanding that human warfare was unlike anything else in the known galaxy. The Ender